Hello and welcome to the next edition of the HP Discover podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Interoper Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on IT innovation and how it's making an impact on people's lives. Our next DevOps thought leadership discussion explores the pitfalls and payoffs of DevOps adoption with an emphasis on the developer perspective. We're here with two prominent IT industry analysts, the founders of RedMonk, to unpack the often tricky path to DevOps and to explore how enterprises can find ways to make pan-IT collaboration a rule, not an exception. With that, please join me in welcoming our guests. We're here with James Governor, founder and principal analyst at RedMonk, and he's based in London. Welcome, James.
Yeah, good morning.
We're also here with Stephen O'Grady, founder and principal analyst at RedMonk, and he's based in Portland, Maine. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks so much for having us.
Gentlemen, let's look at DevOps through a little bit of a different lens. Often it's thought of as a philosophy. It's talked about as a way of improving speed and performance of applications and quality. But ultimately, this is a behavior and a culture discussion. And the behavior and culture of developers is an important part of making DevOps successful. What do you think developers think of DevOps? Is this seen as a positive thing, a threat? Do they have a singular sense of it, or is it perhaps all over the map?
Yeah. So in other words, I would say that the sort of the overwhelming sentiment from developers is positive, simply because if you look at the task for a lot of developers today is going to involve operational tasks, right? So in other words, if you're working, for example, on public cloud platforms, some degree of what you're doing as a developer is operational in nature, and sort of vice versa. Once you get to the operational side, a lot of the operational side has now been automated in ways that look very much like what we used to expect from development. So there's very naturally a convergence between development and operations that developers, frankly, are embracing.
And frankly, I think developers have driven the change. We've seen this in a number of areas, whether it's data management, databases, where the developer said, we're not going to wait for the DBA anymore. We're going to do NoSQL, and we're just going to choose a different store, and we're not going to just use Oracle. We've seen this in different parts of IT, and certainly, bottom line is that waterfall wasn't working. It wasn't leading to the results it should, and developers were taking some of the heat from that. So I think the engineers and developers that have begun to build out what has now become DevOps, a lot of them were cloud native, and they thought they knew best, and in some cases they actually did some really good work. So partly enabled, I think, by cloud computing, frankly. DevOps has made a lot of sense because you're able to touch everything in a way that you weren't able to in an era where you were on-prem. So, I think it's been a developer-led phenomenon. So it would be surprising if developers were feeling threatened by it.
And it seems that enterprises, the traditional Global 2000 variety, see what happens at startups and recognize that they need to get on that same speed trajectory, the agility trajectory. And oftentimes those startups are developer-centric and culturally driven by developers. So if the developers are in fact, the tip on the arrow for DevOps, what is it that the operations people should keep in mind as they bring them more into their sphere where people collaborate, talk together? What advice would you give to the operations side of the house for them to perhaps be better partners with their developer core?
Bottom line is it's coming. This is not an option. An organization could say, well, we have this way of doing ops and we'll continue doing that. Well, that's fine. But to your point about business disruption, we don't have time to wait. We do need to be delivering more products to market faster, particularly in the digital sphere. And the threat posture and the opportunity posture have changed very dramatically in the past 3 years. The idea that Hilton International or Marriott would be worrying about Airbnb, they weren't thinking like that. Or transport companies around the world kind of going, what is the impact of Uber? We've all heard this, software is eating the world and stuff. But what that basically says, I think, is that the threats are real, and also they're not. We used to be in an environment where if you were a bank, you just looked at your 4 peer banks and went, as long as they don't have too much of an advantage, we're okay. But now they're kind of going, oh, we're a bank and we're competing with Google and Facebook and they're doing payment systems and the blockchain is coming. And so I think the tolerance for the tolerance for stability is a little bit lower than it was. I mean, I had a very interesting conversation with a retailer recently, and they had talked about the different goals, I think, that organizations have. And it was very interesting to me that he said that on the first day they launched a new mobile app, it fell over, and they were all high-fiving and fist-bumping because it meant they'd driven so much traffic that the app fell over, and it was something they needed to remediate. That is not how IT normally thinks. And frankly, the business has not told IT they want it to be either. But it's sort of changed. I think the concern for new experiences, new digital products, is now higher than the obsession with stability. So it is a different world. It is a cultural shift.
Right. Whether you're a bank or you're making farm equipment, you're a technology company. At essence, in software is the biggest differentiator you can bring to the market. Stephen, any thoughts about what operations should keep in mind as they become more intertwined with the developer organization?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me is that due to sort of a variety of macro shifts in the market, so things like the availability of open source software, the availability of public cloud. It used to be that IT could control developer populations, right? In other words, they were essentially the arbiter of what went to production, the arbiter of what actually got sort of produced. Because if you're a developer and you have a good idea, but you don't have any hardware or infrastructure to run it on, then you're kind of out of luck. These days that's changed, and we see this organizationally, where developers can, go to sort of IT, go to operations and say, hey, I need infrastructure, and they'll say 6 months, and the developers say, the hell with 6 months, I'm going to go to Amazon, and all of a sudden I have something up in 90 seconds. So basically, I think that the notion that is most important, I think, for operations is that they're going to have to work with developer populations, because one way or another, developers are going to get what they want.
All right. Now, when we think about the supplier, the vendor side of things, almost every vendor I've talked to in the last 2 or 3 months has raised DevOps. It's become very top of mind for them. And yet, if you were to ask an organization, how do you install DevOps? How do you buy DevOps? What shape box does it come in? None of those questions are relevant because it's not a product. How do the vendors, how do the suppliers start to make the availability of DevOps something more attainable? Grease the skids towards adoption, if you will. What do you think needs to happen from those tools, platforms, and technologies?
Okay. I mean, I think there's one thing there that it's very easy to say, okay, DevOps is not a product. And yeah, that's true. On the other hand, there are some underlying technologies would have driven this, particularly in automation and the notion of configuration as code. So if you're in ops and you're not currently looking at tools like Chef, Puppet, Ansible, SaltStack, you are doing yourself a disservice. They are powerful tools in the arsenal. Now, I think one of the things to understand there in the world of open source is perhaps it's going to be packaged by a more traditional vendor. But I think that certainly one of the things is rethinking how you do automation. And I would counsel anyone in IT ops to say, well, at least have a team starting to look at that, perhaps for some new development that you are doing. Because I think it's a little bit, it's easy to say everything is a massive transformation, because, then it's just a big services opportunity, and we can be like, oh yeah, this is, lots of hand waving. But at the end of the day, I mean, DevOps has been a tools-driven phenomenon, and it's actually about being closer to the metal. It's having better observability. It's having a better sense of how the application's working. And I think one of the key things is the change in responsibility. We have lived in an environment, we remember blame game and, lots of finger pointing. If you look at Netflix, that doesn't happen. The developer that breaks the build fixes it. So I think that there are some significant changes in culture, but yeah, I think that there are some tools that organizations should be looking at.
Well, I would say if we're talking from the vendor perspective, right, there's not a lot they can essentially talk to their customers about cultural change and organizational change that's necessary to achieve, essentially the results that they want. But they can't actually affect that, right? In other words, what we're talking about rather is what they can do. And basically, I think the most important thing that vendors who play in this and sort of related spaces, can do is essentially understand that it's a continuum, right? From the first code that gets written to checked in to built, to deployed, onto infrastructure that's configured, using sort of automated software. Basically, it's a very, very long chain, a very long sequence of events. So understanding from a vendor perspective where you fit into that life cycle, what are the other pieces you have to integrate with, and from a customer perspective, what are all the different pieces they're going to be using is critical. Because in other words, if you come in sort of and you're focused on a particular functional capability, and that's the only thing that you're aware of, that's the only thing that you tackle, then you're doing your customer a disservice, because you're not going to, there are too many moving pieces for any one vendor to tackle them all. So it's going to be critically important that you are partner friendly, project friendly, and so on, and integrate well and play nicely with others.
But also don't let crisis go to waste. I mean, IT ops is frankly, yeah, they have budget, but they're also always getting a kick in the teeth. Anything that goes wrong is their fault, even if it's someone else. And the simple fact is that we are in an environment where organizations, as I've said, are thinking, well, threat and opportunity posture has changed. It is time to invest in this. So I think a good example of this would be, we always talk about standardization, but then nobody wants to give us the budget to do that. I mean, one of the things that we've tended to see in these web companies, these web native companies, in how they manage operations and so on, is that actually they've done an awful lot of standardization of what the infrastructure looks like. So there is an opportunity here, and it's a threat and an opportunity as ever.
I've been speaking with a few users, and here are a couple of rationales from them that is accelerating the adoption of a DevOps mentality. One of them is security and compliance, because the operations people can get more information back to the developers. Developers can insist that security gets baked in early and often. The other one is user experience, that the operations side of the house is now got the data from the user, especially when you talk about mobile apps and smaller customer-facing applications and web apps. All that data is now being gathered, and what happens with the application can be getting back to development very quickly. So there's a feedback loop that's compressed. What do you think needs to happen in order for the incentives to quicken the adoption of DevOps from the perspective of security and user experience and feedback loops of shared data?
That's such a good question, and it's going to remain an ongoing challenge. I mean, the simple fact is that, as I said about the retailer and the mobile app, different parts of the business have different goals. I mean, finance does not have the same goals as sales, does not have the same goals as marketing, in fact. And within IT, there are different groups that have had very different KPIs. And I think that's part of the discussion. I think you're absolutely right to bring that up, that understanding what are the metrics we should be using, what are the new metrics for success? Is it the number of products that we're able, the number of new products or changes to our application code that we can run out? I mean, we're all incredibly impressed by Etsy and Netflix because they can make all of these changes per day to their production environment. Not everybody wants to do that, but I think it's what are these KPIs? So it might be, as Stephen had mentioned clearly, if previously we were waiting 6 months in order to get access to server and storage, and we get that down to a minute or so, I think it's pretty obvious that that's a substantive step forward. I think you're absolutely right to say that it is about the data. I think when we began on this transition around Agile and so on, there was a notion that, oh, those guys don't care about data, they don't care about compliance. I think the opposite is true, that actually there's been a real focus on data to enable the developer to do better work. I think in terms of this shift that we are seeing, there's actually, I think, an interesting model that funnily enough, HP has begun talking about, which is shifting left. And what they mean by that is taking that testing earlier into the process. We had been in an environment where a developer would hand off to someone else, who would hand off to someone else, and every different step of the way. And I think the notion that testing happens early and happens often is super important in this regard.
Yeah, continuous delivery, service virtualization are really seemingly taking off now. But just want to give Stephen an opportunity to address this alignment of interests, security, user experience, and data, shared data. Thoughts about how organizations should enforce adoption, maybe enforce is a strong word, but encourage adoption using these aligned interests.
Well, I can't speak to the security angle as much. I mean, in other words, I think there's aspects to that, particularly when we think about configuration management and, the things that you can do via automation and so on. But the big one for me, I think, is user experience, and that to me is, frankly, where a lot of the DevOps movement has come from. Because in other words, what we found out is that if you want to deliver sort of an ideal experience to, via an application to 100 people or 1,000 people, that's not terribly difficult. And, what you're using infrastructure-wise to address that is also not a, sort of huge challenge. On the flip side, you start talking millions and tens of millions of users, hundreds of millions of users potentially, then you have a completely different set of challenges involved. And what we've seen from that is that the infrastructure necessary to deliver quality experiences, whether you're Netflix or Facebook or Google, or even just a large bank or whomever, that is a brand new challenge. And then when you get into not just sort of delivering a quality experience through a browser, but delivering it through a mobile application, this encourages and in fact necessitates a series of architectural changes, right? Scale out and all these other sort of wonderful things we can talk about, which by themselves then necessitate, okay, if we're dealing with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of machines instead of a handful of very, very large ones, then we need a different approach, right? And that different approach in many respects is going to be DevOps. It's going to be taking a very hands-on developer approach to sort of traditional operational tasks.
But security is definitely an elephant stomping around the room. There's no question. The feedback loop around DevOps has not been as fixated on security as it might be. Quite frankly, developers are about getting things done, and this is the constant challenge, ops, security and so on. But look at Docker. Developers absolutely love it. But it didn't start from the position of how do we make this the most secure model you could ever have for application deployment. I think there are some sort of weird people have started to use the word DevSecOps. But there's a lot of unicorns and rainbows, and there's going to be a mess that needs clearing up. Frankly, security is something that we generally don't do that well. But on the other hand, as I said, we're less concerned with stability. And I think on the security side, it does kind of seem like, look at privacy. We all gave up on that, right?
I suppose. Let's not give up on security, though, right?
Well, those things go together.
They do. They are.
And certainly the organizations that would claim to be really good at security are the ones that have been, leaving all of their customer details on a USB stick or on a laptop. The security industry has not done itself has not done itself as many favors. They need to step up, I think, as much as developers do.
As we close out, maybe we can develop some suggestions for organizations that create a culture for DevOps or put in place the means for DevOps. And again, in speaking with a number of users recently, automation orchestration seems to come to mind as having that in place to be able to scale, to be able to provide the data back, monitoring and data from a big data perspective across systems, pan IT data, and the ability to measure that user experience. Any other thoughts about what you as an organization should put in place that will foster a DevOps mentality?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think one thing you didn't mention is kind of pager duty. And it is the fact that somebody's going to get called out to fix the thing, and it's about individuals taking responsibility. With that responsibility may come a higher salary. That's an interesting challenge for IT because they're always told, here are a bunch of tools that enable perhaps the type Bs to get stuff done. One thing I would say, back to your point about whether this is a cultural shift or a product shift, I think the functional areas you mentioned are absolutely right, but the culture, I would just say that get out and start spending time reading the stuff that the web companies that are doing this well are sharing. If you look at Etsy or Netflix, or they're not keeping this close to their chest. Netflix, in fact, is provided the tools it uses to improve stability through Chaos Monkey. So that there's much more sharing, there's much more there. And I think the natural thing would be, why do you want to go to an event? And I would just say one thing is that, go to developer events. They are the people building out this new culture and kind of embedding yourself in this developer aesthetic, where, GitHub talks about optimizing for developer joy. Etsy is about engineering happiness. And when I heard Marks and Spencer's, a retailer, recently say to me, they turned around after I had given them my pitch, and they're like, yeah, engineering happiness, we're looking at Etsy. We all need to be doing a bit of that. So I think that's one of the things. There's so much more information there than there used to be.
Stephen, what should be in place in organizations to foster better DevOps adoption?
Well, it's a interesting question. I think the thing that comes to mind for me, there's a great story from Adrian Cockcroft, who used to be with Netflix, who we've obviously talked about a couple of times, is now over with Battery Ventures. And he gives a very interesting talk, where he goes out and talks to, executives and senior, sort of technology executives from all these Fortune 500 companies. And one of the things he gets asked sort of over and over and over is, where do you find, engineers, like the ones, that work at Netflix? Where do we find these people that can do this sort of miraculous DevOps work? And his response is, we hired them from you. So, basically the singular lesson that I would tell all the organizations is that, somewhere in your organization probably are the people who know how this stuff works and want to get it done. And, a lot of times it's basically just empowering them, getting out of the way and letting this stuff happen, as opposed to trying to put the brakes on all the time.
So allowing the organic DevOps to happen as well as the top-down DevOps.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Well, great. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've been talking with two prominent IT industry analysts, the founders of RedMonk, on unpacking the path to DevOps. I'd like to thank them. Thank you, gentlemen. We've been here with James Governor, founder and principal analyst at RedMonk. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And also Stephen O'Grady, also the founder and principal analyst at RedMonk. Thank you, Stephen.
Appreciate it, Dana.
And thank you as well to our audience for joining us for this DevOps thought leadership discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, principal analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of HP-sponsored discussions. Thanks again for listening, and come back next time.